Good morning, friends. One of the big things we talked about yesterday was how the Pharisees were just so legalistic in their attitude, not only toward Jesus and the disciples, but basically toward everyone concerning everything. And I mentioned that I wanted to explore the difference between legalism and the opposite attitude, sometimes called licentiousness, and how to strike the proper middle ground between those two sinful extremes. And so today I want to explore legalism a bit more, and then tomorrow, Lord willing, we'll look at licentiousness. And then, of course, we'll try to figure out how to avoid both those kind of sins and behave as we're supposed to. But for today, what is legalism? Well, we might be tempted to say that anyone who is really concerned about following the law, well, that would be a legalist. But that actually would be painting with far too broad a brush, because legalism of the sort we see the Pharisees indulging in is downright sinful. But it's not sinful to care about the law of God. It's not even sinful to care about legitimate man-made laws either. And that's an important thing for us to understand and hold on to. Because people who are on the other side, the licentious side, the side that disregards God's law or laws in general completely, they are fond of accusing anyone who cares about laws or just the concept of laws, of right and wrong, and doing things properly. They are very fond of accusing anyone who cares like that of being legalists. But that isn't necessarily so. In the very first psalm, we're told that the righteous man delights in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. In Psalm 119, we're told that those who walk in the law of the Lord are blessed. So clearly, it's a good thing to care about and to seek to obey God's law. And doing so does not make you guilty of legalism. So to clarify what actual legalism is and what it looks like, and especially what makes it sinful, let's go to the Gospel of Luke chapter 11, verse 39 to start us off. This is an occasion where Jesus basically describes to the Pharisees just what is wrong with them regarding their legalistic attitudes. He starts off by saying, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." Then bopping down to verse 42, "But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." Now, in this quite compact litany of woes, Jesus details four things that make legalism so bad. First is because those who have a legalistic mindset, they end up focusing on the external things at the expense of the internal things. Secondly, they major on the minors. Third, they are motivated by pride in the pursuit of self-glory. And finally, all of this ends up leading other people astray as well. So let's unpack that first concept a little bit. In verse 39, Jesus uses the illustration of the Pharisees cleaning the outside of a cup or of a bowl while the inside is filthy with greed and wickedness. The point, of course, is obvious. In their legalism, the Pharisees were concerned with looking good on the outside, but it didn't matter what they were like on the inside. They were as corrupt as could be on the inside. Outwardly, they appeared righteous, and that's what they wanted people to perceive them as, but inwardly, they were actually more sinfully traitorous than the tax collectors that they despise so much. For this reason, the legalist tends to be a hypocrite, portraying one thing on the outside, but the reality is just the opposite on the inside. Secondly, in verse 42, we see that the legalist majors on the minors. Jesus points out that the Pharisee tithes from the produce of every herb in their herb garden. Now, that's getting very, minute measurements and very small items that they're tithing from. And Jesus actually does go on to say that's a good thing, and they shouldn't stop doing that. But he also says that they are doing that at the expense of the justice and love of God. As Matthew records this conversation, Jesus even calls these things the weightier matters of the law. Justice and love, the weightier matters of the law, which again gives us even more credence to the idea that some laws are simply more important than others. Now, Jesus didn't say ignore the tithe. He didn't say stop tithing your herbs. But he's certainly saying don't tithe so fastidiously, thinking that that's going to get you somewhere with God, when you don't even bother to exercise the love and justice of God in your conduct. Again, they were majoring on the minors, nitpicking the fine details of how much they were tithing, okay? But as Jesus said elsewhere, they were doing all of that, straining out a gnat, but swallowing a camel. Thirdly, legalism exists for the person's own self-aggrandizement, for their own glory. Jesus says of the Pharisees in verse 43 that they love the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. In other words, they love positions of honor. They loved being honored. They loved hearing people call them rabbi or some other uplifting honorific, some other exalting appellation. And really, to be honest with you, I know the danger of that. When I first became a pastor, it was a heady sensation when people called me pastor for the first time. I really enjoyed it. I'm just being honest with you. I really enjoyed it, but I had to get over that as quickly as possible. And I had a senior pastor over me that helped me to do that, because that is a very dangerous thing, because the positions God puts us in are not designed for our glory, but for His. But a legalistic attitude uses the law of God and any rules they can tack on of their own making to the law of God. They use it to push other people down and to lift themselves up. And that is just absolutely not okay. But then lastly, and perhaps most sad of all, is that such legalism tends to lead others astray, such that they fall into the same deceptive sin as well. Jesus says that the Pharisees are unmarked graves and people walk over them without knowing it. The point here being that according to the laws of ceremonial cleanliness in the Old Covenant, contact with any dead thing, including a grave, would make you ceremonially unclean, so that you could not, go to the temple and worship and various other things. And so, for this reason, to not interrupt the person's ability to go and worship, to remain clean, tombs and graves were clearly marked so that people could stay away from them unless they were, forced to interact with them, in burying a family member or whatever the case might have been, at which point it was expected that they were going to be unclean. But it was not okay to just, in the normal course of your day, to become unclean that way, because that would hinder your ability to worship. So Jesus' point is that the Pharisees were like unmarked graves. And so that people, didn't realize that they were becoming unclean by listening to and mimicking the attitudes of the Pharisees. Again, in another place, Jesus declares of the Pharisees, you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte or convert, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. You see, Jesus was more concerned that the Pharisees were not only condemning themselves in their legalism, but they were also leading other people into that same legalism and taking them with them kind of in their condemnation. And so that is a broader, well, I don't know if it's broader, but a more particular picture of someone who is actually legalistic. And of course, none of those qualities are good, and they all tend to lead from one into the other. But it's important to understand and remember once again that the person who simply loves God's word and his commands, they're not a legalist just because of that. After all, Jesus said that if we love him, we will obey his commands. So someone who obeys God's law and seeks to encourage others to do so as well, motivated by love for Christ, that person is far from a legalist. And if that person gets called a legalist or gets accused of the sin of legalism, that person just let it roll right off their back because it's not true. Okay? It's the person who does those four things that we just talked about, or any one or any combination of those four things, that you can know is involved in the actual sin of legalism. Focusing on external matters to the exclusion of the internal. Majoring on the minors and ignoring the truly important stuff. Doing all of these things to puff themselves up, again, generally at the expense of others, as it comes to keeping the rules they actually care about. And finally, leading others astray by giving them a really bad example to follow. Because again, this kind of legalism really cares nothing about grace or mercy, and therefore it stands in direct opposition to the actual gospel of Jesus Christ, which of course is all about the grace and mercy of God. which ought to lead us then to extend grace and mercy to others as well. So, friends, love the law of God, obey the commands of Christ, but avoid the kind of legalism that we just talked about for the sake of the gospel. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.